All right, excellent. So, hello everyone. Hope you are having a good beginning to your semester. What we're gonna do today is another um, intro-y kind of thing. We're the first real big philosophy reading we're gonna do is from the Charles Taylor book. So, if you haven't gotten that already, try to get it as soon as possible. It's this one here. A Secular Age. We're going to be using that one for a good long while, actually. That'll be kind of the first two, maybe not 2 months, but first like month and a half or so of the course. We'll actually be working our way through a pretty good chunk of that book, actually. Not all of it, but we'll get a pretty good chunk of the way through it. Our We're not going to take Taylor as like a necessarily, the word of God or anything like that. He's super cool. He's interesting. He's worth spending a lot of time with. I'll have things that I like, things that I disagree with. We don't have to necessarily agree with all of his claims, but he's going to at least, I think, give us a really interesting way of maybe thinking about some of the questions of the course. And so provide us also some good sense of some historical context that I think is really helpful to really actually asking this question of what is religion? What is the meaning of religion? And asking it in a good way. And the reason I wanted us to start with this Karen Armstrong piece, that has to be the first thing we read, is that in effect, what she's doing is a very simplified summary of what Taylor is going to say. And Taylor's not very good, we'll see, at summarizing what his actual conclusions are. He's very good at detail. He's less good at like structure and making everything like big picture clear what's going on. But this piece actually that we read for today gives us a reasonably good summary of at least in a very huge big picture sense of what Taylor is going to be arguing as well. So it'll be helpful in that regard. This will give us a good sense of where we're going to go for the beginning parts of the semester. And then the plan is basically we're going to start like Taylor starts pretty much just in Western Europe. So England, France, maybe Germany, a little bit of Spain, United States. And then we're going to sort of expand the story outward from there as the semester goes along. And Taylor himself is well aware of the limitations of what he's doing. He's well aware that he's only looking at not even all of Christianity, just Western Protestantism and Western Christianity and Catholicism. But it'd be a helpful starting point, at least, because most of our understandings of religion, at least if you grew up within Western Europe, probably came out of that. So starting there, getting clearer about maybe like what we're presupposing, then we can challenge it by spreading outward. Right. And we'll spend but we're going to spread outward both in time. We're going to go back farther. Taylor basically starts late Middle Ages. We'll go back a little bit in time. And also outward beyond Europe. We'll spend some time with some Indian thought, some Chinese thought, some African thought. Move beyond the boundaries of Europe too. So that's the plan for today. We're just going to basically talk our way through the article and sort of get a sense of big picture thesis, what's being suggested here. Anyone have any initial thoughts, questions, comments about anything before we turn to the readings? Any questions about course structure or anything like that? All right, so the first daily assignments, we're going to do one together as a group on Tuesday. The first one you'll have to do on your own is next Thursday. So we got a week for it, not one today. What it will look like, though, is pretty much we can talk. You would have taken this article and you would have identified what you thought was Karen Armstrong's thesis, and then one piece of evidence she gives in defense of that thesis. So maybe today we could say her thesis is that the idea of a secular state, secular liberal democracy, is itself something that emerged at a particular historical moment of time in Europe's history. And her evidence for that maybe is the way in which one piece of evidence maybe would be the way in which various European states reacted to the devastation caused by the 30 Years' War. Something like that. That's an example of the sort of thing. 2 sentences, boom, boom. What's the thesis? What's one piece of evidence given in defense of them? Obviously, there's more than you could have done than I just said. More evidence, certainly. And you could even identify like different sub-theses within it. That's fine too. The first one of those, again, that'll just be on Thursday. So that'll be the beginning of assignments, and there'll be one most every day we have a reading, at least. There'll be a daily assignment to go along with it. Awesome. Good. Any questions, thoughts, comments, anything? I think I fixed the chat, so the group chat should now be working. And remember, feel free, interrupt, ask questions in the chat. You can unmute yourself when you got something. Let me know. You raise your do the Zoom hand raise thing. I can call on you. Whatever you want. The goal is to have this as much as possible be a discussion, given the limitations of the Zoom format. So let's just begin where Armstrong begins. So she wrote this article in 2014. It was in a newspaper, The Guardian. So a popular publication. Karen Armstrong herself is a historian of religion. That's what she does. She's probably the most famous historian of religion going. She's written a lot of works, particularly in sort of a cross-cultural dialogue contexts, particularly a lot of things putting Christian sources and Islamic sources in dialogue with one another. So that's her big thing. So that's the thing she probably knows the best. And she's writing in the context of the rise of ISIS and ISIL in the 2014 in Syria, northern Iraq, and she's reacting against what she sees as a meaningfully significant misunderstanding that people in the West have about Islam. She thinks that there's a meaningful misunderstanding taking place, and a misunderstanding that has dramatically real world consequences. Like, this isn't just some intellectual discussion, right? That leads to real world policy mistakes being made too. And the mistake that she thinks that people in the West are prone to make is to assume that obviously, and anytime anyone says obviously, you should always put it in quotes, right? Obviously, religion is a private matter. Right? Obviously, religion is not the same thing as politics. Religion obviously is a separate thing from politics. And therefore, the problem in the Middle East is due to the blending of religion and politics together. Right? And you saw this from various different sources. A lot of the stuff that the Bush administration did in Iraq was sort of assuming that was the case. That obviously everyone in Iraq just wanted to have private religion. They didn't want religion to be part of public life. This assumption shows itself in various sorts of ways, and we'll talk about some of the historical antecedents of this too. And the claim that Armstrong is making, the central claim, is that assumption is not universal by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, she goes so far as to say that it would have been an incomprehensible assumption in most of Europe 200 years ago. Most of Europe wouldn't have even understood that claim, maybe more like 300 years ago, but let alone other cultures outside of Europe. And indeed, so we'll go big picture first, and then we'll narrow in on the details. But big picture claim that she's advancing today is the understanding of religion as something private, of a liberal democracy style secular state. So this term liberal democracy, let's go to the screen whiteboard for a second. Want to make sure just we're all on the same page with it. All right, so the liberal in this word, liberal democracy, it doesn't refer to politics in the modern sense of the term. The liberal in this refers to basically a free market economy with church-state separation. That's basically what's meant by a liberal democracy. And so that's the liberal part. The democracy part, obviously, participatory democracy of some sort. I'll talk about liberal democracies a lot throughout the semester. That's what we mean. We don't mean liberal in the sense of liberal or conservative. It's an earlier usage of the word liberal, where the liberals were the people who wanted free market economics, basically. So that's what I mean. And secularism, we're going to spend a lot of time in Taylor defining this word, but let's just define it for right now. Right? Secularism is basically just non-religious. We'll have a lot more to say. That's not an adequate definition of this word, but it's good enough to start. It's a good enough provisional definition anyway. We'll complicate it, nuance it as we sort of go. But when you hear talk about sort of secular institutions, what it means is governmental institutions that don't have a religious affiliation. So even in a country like England, where there is a national religion in England, the Anglican Church, but the institutions of government are not themselves Anglican, right? So they're secular institutions, and the government form is a liberal democracy. And liberal democracy doesn't have to go with secularism, but it can in many cases. And again, at least in Western Europe anyway, it has tended to. These two things tended to have gone together. Everyone good so far? Any questions, thoughts, anything at this point? Good start. All right. So yeah, go ahead, Magnus. Go ahead.
So I would just wonder, just like on that kind of example, it feels like a very sort of difficult term to apply, because I think that there could be a big case to be made that, you know, England is not secular since, you know, the Queen is the head of the church.
Yeah, right.
And that is an institution of government.
I mean, it's debatable whether or not the Queen is the head of the state to any meaningful extent.
Yeah.
but yeah, as I know, and indeed, we're going to see there are indeed going to be all kinds of complications with applying a term like that. So I agree with you. And we're going to see secular means more than not religious. That's going to be one of Taylor's central projects. We'll see this right away in the introduction when we turn to it on Tuesday, is to actually propose a pretty actually radically novel definition of what secularism is. The sense of which we can mean it again just for today is almost just by way of sort of like a negative contrast, right? Whether you think this yourself, if you've heard other people say it, right? Oh, all those Middle Eastern countries, they have theocracies, right? Where the religion is in some sense running the society. Whatever you might want to say about England, that's not going on in England. Right, and certainly France even more so. That's not, whatever you want to say. That's not, again, even though the Catholic Church is involved in life in various kinds of ways. So just by a certain kind of like contrast, at least, that we can just, for now, that's why I say it just means anti or non-religious. That's all we can sort of mean by it, in contrast with what we think of as religiously governed societies, like people frequently say about the Middle East, or maybe. Maybe like with modern India, that's even more debatable. I mean, it's debatable in the Middle East, but it's even more debatable in modern India. But maybe you might hear some people talk that way, at least. Does that work? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that clarifies a lot for today.
Okay, good. Any other questions at this point? All right, good. Now let's keep moving on along this track. So, in terms of the real world political, consequences of this assumption, she thinks that because Western countries are making this assumption, that they're thinking that there's people in the West have a tendency to just think, oh, there's something just wrong with the Middle East, right? Because they're not making this assumption, obviously, that religion is a private matter, not a public one. And so something must just be wrong with them. And that leads to real world, again, political kinds of policies being enacted, in potentially dangerous, disastrous consequences. I mean, her ultimate thesis is what gives rise to religious extremism is trying to impose secularism on places that don't want it. in a sense, that is going to be her overall thesis at the very end of the reading. So that's the negative consequences. That's where she's going with them. But she wants to do more than just that. She wants to help us, maybe from her perspective at least, think through the situation more clearly, not even with regard to the history of the Middle East, but with regard to our own assumptions. Why do we all assume that religion is a private matter? That's the central question, really, of today. Brittany, go ahead.
So I think that there's kind of just answering what you just posed there question-wise. I think that there's maybe a fundamental misunderstanding between different religious ideologies, and there's the thought that, oh, everybody's so different, which means we can't get along. And I think this all goes without saying, but I think that because we percolate on the differences rather than finding commonality to agree upon, that's, I guess that's kind of, hopefully that makes sense. This is my third class back to back, so I'm a little drained.
I understand. And indeed, no, I think certainly within the context of America, literally, that's how the founding fathers expressed why they were formulating the kind of government that they did. That the only way you could have a kind of religious peace is if everyone was more or less allowed to do their own thing. Now, it's interesting, actually, you read the Founding Fathers, they're well aware of the cost of doing this. You read, like, say, like Jefferson, and he basically says, like, yeah, and as a result of this, the overwhelming majority of people are going to end up in hell because they're going to, like, do their own thing, and their own thing is going to be catastrophically stupid. But that's fine because, you know, it'll allow those few who are elect, they'll be saved, and we won't kill each other in the interim. Right, that was sort of the way the Founding Fathers sort of put it, right? This sort of freedom of conscience that everyone has to be free to pick for themselves what they're going to do, almost just because it's each individual person is the one who's going to have to live with the consequences of the choice. Good. Someone in the chat brought something up. Let me go get caught up there. Yeah, because again, there's someone suggesting here that perhaps it's because it's sort of a desire to avoid a certain kind of oversight. I think that's absolutely right. And again, go back to the history of the American Founding Fathers and also even what goes on in England too. There's a real suspicion of the ability of sort of like you might think of as high church traditions, like the Catholic Church, for example, the authority or the competency of them to actually reach sort of authoritative religious conclusions. Making people want the freedom to sort of not be bound by the flawed operations of various kinds of official churches. That makes sense. And then someone suggesting that is there sort of or asking, is there anything that because we sort of have the sense that religion has to be private, that we sort of think that therefore like we have a right for it to be private? And sure, again, I think you can sort of see that. We'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about John Locke. People definitely kind of, this assumption, people, what always happens when you assume things, you forget you assume them in the first place, and you just assume it's the natural way things should be and have to be, right? Rather than historically conditioned in various kinds of ways. So yeah, all of that seems right. All that seems like a really good starting point for us. Let's go back a little bit historically. And Taylor's going to go back even farther because Armstrong basically goes back to like the late 1500s is where she starts, and Taylor's going to go back even late Middle Ages, which we'll have to do to tell the story more accurately. Okay, there are two things that happen at basically the same time. People start to make this assumption and start organizing societies on the basis of this assumption, and Protestantism emerges. The Protestant Reformation happens. They happen more or less at exactly the same time. And one important thing to note about what I'm calling this assumption is Protestant. It is first clearly articulated in the history of Western Christianity by Martin Luther. So when I say it's like happening at the same time as the Protestant Reformation, right? Like, yep, Martin Luther, that's about as central to the Protestant Reformation as you can get, is Martin Luther, right? And he's the first person to articulate this sense clearly. And then Calvin as well articulates it. And then, it spreads from Calvin to Puritans in England. And then from Puritans in England, it goes to us, right? And so that's sort of the history of this idea, this way of conceiving of it. When it's happening, the Catholic Church is like, what are you talking about? That's crazy. Because prior to this point in European history, that view would have seemed crazy. We'll talk about this a lot in the Taylor. Religion was civic. It was something you all did with your community when you got together before the harvest and paraded a saint around the fields to keep demons at bay from them. Right? That doesn't make sense as a private activity. That's not something you do by yourself. That only makes sense as the thing that the entire community does together. Similarly, masses, right? You'll all be stunned by how rarely people in the Middle Ages went to church. Maybe once a year, on average. The average person maybe went once a year. And there was real pushback, actually, when bishops tried to, mandate that. even going that much, right? But when they did go, when did they go? It was the Christmas Mass or the Easter Mass, which was a huge, again, civic event, a public day, not just even going to church and hearing the preacher preach and then going and having a nice dinner with your family or something, right? That was a festival day, a day that the entire community came together. So the sense that religion is something you individually do in private, this is indeed Luther's central innovation in a certain sense religiously. And it's important to note this is a Protestant innovation. Prior to this, the Catholic understanding was that the individual related to God not as an individual, but through the larger Christian community, right? Which is why masses were in Latin, which no one could read or speak, right? So literally, like, you'd be in a Latin service, like, you wouldn't understand at all what was happening, but that's sort of irrelevant. The point isn't that you understand what's happening. The point is that you're taking part in the life of the church, and it's that through that life of the church that you would be saved rather than your personal individualized relationship with God. That would be the source of your salvation. Luther's innovation is, again, turning that on its head. We'll talk about why, and the reason why he turns it on its head is really fascinating. Another thing that was not going on very much in medieval Catholicism was hell. That was not a frequent topic of conversation. It was a part of theology and all that, but it wasn't big. It wasn't emphasized to any extent. That's going to change, and it's going to change again roughly the same time Luther is coming. But okay, so the first thing to note, we need to understand that this is a Protestant assumption, and it is why, as I mentioned last class, I have heard some modern day Islamic theologians argue that liberal democracy and the idea of secularism are just Protestant ideas. And so to say that Islamic countries should adopt liberal democracy and secularism is just to say, these theologians claim, you all should become Protestants and stop being Muslims, right? Because the claim is that this assumption is not compatible with Islam, or even debatable, even more provocatively with Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity as well. That it is a particularly Protestant way of conceiving of things. Taylor will go into that in much more detail than Armstrong does, but I just wanted to, this is sort of big picture day, so I wanted to give you that sense of the big picture. Again, let's pause for a second. How's everyone doing? Questions, thoughts, comments, anything so far? Awesome, then let's keep on moving on. All right, so what happens to make this mainstream? Because the way I'm telling you this story, right, the Protestant Reformation is happening, but there's also a lot of Catholics too, right? So how did this go from being a specific piece of sort of Lutheran or Calvinist theology? How did it become the mainstream organizing principle of society? Again, there's going to be a lot more to say, and we're going to say it, but the rough, simple outline, this becomes popularized by the reaction against the 30 Years' War in Europe. The 30 Years' War in Europe is from 16... I wrote it down because I can never remember the exact dates of it. I don't think it's actually literally 30 years either, making the dates even more confusing to remember. There we go, yeah, 1618 to 1648, yeah. So, yeah, go ahead.
I apologize to circle back to a question I didn't realize I had.
That's all right.
With regards to the notes that you take during class,
Mm-hmm.
do you post those in any way?
Not literally, at least. Like the whiteboard, the Canvas whiteboard is restricted to Canvas. Oh, not the Canvas, sorry. The Zoom whiteboard it just exists as long as the file exists. But all these sessions are going to be recorded, so at the very least, you can go back to them in that way.
Okay, all right, thank you. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. It's a good question. Yeah, good question. There's no way for me to directly photocopy the whiteboard though, unfortunately, or make copies of it. Right. So the 30 Years' War was really a monumentally important event in the history of Europe, but it's a sort of super weird event. As Armstrong points out, this started as a war between Catholics and Protestants, but it didn't stay that way. Right. So at first, you've got a bunch of Protestant princes, almost all of them whom are Lutherans. Roughly at the same time, you had the Huguenot revolts happening in France. So that would be the Calvinist version of a similar idea. And you had these various kinds of Catholic nations sort of waging war with these German princes, because what we think of as the nation of Germany is really new. It's like 150 years old. But prior to the nation of Germany, there was just literally hundreds of different princedoms. And a lot of these princedoms converted because one of the things Luther was promoting was the power of the princes. So, okay, that's how this war started. It doesn't end that way, though. By the end, you got Protestants and Catholics teaming up to fight other Protestants and Catholics. It basically turns into a war between France and the rest of Europe, pretty much, where Catholic France just sort of like is like, hey, you know, it would be great if Catholic France owned everything. That would solve all of our problems, and the rest of Europe didn't necessarily agree. So it began as perhaps what we might think of as a religious war. It doesn't end that way, but the ending kind of, people forget the ending. People only remember how it started. And, sorry. Go back to the screen share. Everyone good? Everyone good now? Okay for me to move out?
Are you okay if we screenshot the whiteboard?
Okay, go ahead. That's fine. That's absolutely fine, yeah. Okay, so what happens after the 30 Years' War is what get called these Edicts of Tolerance. It's part of the Peace of Westphalia, which was what ends the war. And it's basically that, like, the various individual nation states, it gets decided, well, they get to determine what their own religions are within them, right? So if like a Lutheran prince wants his citizens to be Lutheran, they're all going to be Lutheran and no one else will cause problems. Or France wants to be Catholic, fine, no one's going to cause any issues with it. The Pope was not a huge fan of the Peace of Westphalia, but as you can imagine. And this gets the way this gets framed in terms of European consciousness is that this has to be the case now, or else we'll have the 30 Years' War break out again, right? Whereas in fact, I mean, the 30 Years' War was pretty swiftly not about religion, and it's not as if after the 30 Years' War you stop having wars between these very powerful European nation states, right? That's just not what happens. But in terms of people's popular mindset, the sense is that if religion is not even personal, but if it's not decided by each individual nation, we'll get these horrible wars. And then eventually that becomes extended and through people like John Locke to, if religion's not something that each individual decides for themselves, that will be what leads to violence within a nation, right? Because the Lutheran ideal is that the prince will decide the nation that the subjects all follow. So by the time you get then to people like John Locke and you get sort of America, founding of America, right now it's that each individual is going to have to decide this for themselves, with attendant costs and weaknesses, as we've sort of talked about. Okay, so again, people okay with this? You're gonna have to do a little bit of history lessons as part of this, but I'm gonna try to just give you a big picture upshots of all of it. So everyone good so far? All right. Now let's get closer to recognizable modernity. Once this assumption becomes popular and modern and sort of like widespread, people forget that it was an assumption. People forget that things were ever differently. And almost immediately what happens, you see this immediately in John Locke, people in Western Europe, almost overwhelmingly Protestants, start to think that anyone who is not making this assumption is a savage. And so who are we talking about here? Well, Catholics. Because again, the Catholic Church doesn't change its view that the Catholic Church is the arbiter of what God's will actually is, right? And so indeed, increasingly within Protestant nations, Catholicism gets viewed as savage, to the extent that up until the 1960s, the KKK couldn't decide if it hated Italians more or less than it hated the Jews, right? Because the Italians were Catholics. And there was serious concern for most of US history of the danger of Catholics coming into this country and perverting it with their savagery. Right? Well, again, what is the savagery? The savagery is, in a very real sense, thinking that religion is not private. Right? Who else got painted by this brush? Well, again, we can see John Locke is an excellent example for this. All of the people that would be really convenient to enslave were savages, because they too did not have this private religious thing, right? So we're talking about the native inhabitants of North America, which John Locke was directly involved in the exploitation of. And we're talking about the North Atlantic slave trade, we're talking about Africans. And again, Locke actually even says Locke actually basically says people who don't accept that religion is private can be enslaved, because they are a danger to everyone else, and yada, yada, yada. And Armstrong, went into this in some detail. So right away, is this move toward the privatization of religion produces a different kind of violence, right? Certainly it doesn't produce the same kind of like religions fighting each other sort of violence, but it produces violence against religions that don't think religion is private, weirdly enough. Right? And we're using religion in air quotes here, but things that would be called religions anyway, that don't view the world in that regard. This becomes really explicit in the French Revolution in France. So now we're moving upwards to the 1790s. The French Revolution, one of its major functions is the abolition of Catholicism in France. Doesn't fully succeed, but that's what it tries to do anyway. And how does it try to do this? Through the terror, right? Literally through anti-religious terror, I guess, right? By persecution of the Catholic clergy that was in France, confiscation of assets, and literally just killing people too, like cutting off people's heads. Right. And indeed, what happens shortly after, Armstrong argues, and I think this is right, a lot of people have made the same observation besides her, is that very quickly what happens in France is that, or revolutionary France, let's say, is that people stop being Catholic and the new religion of the state becomes the state itself. The state as religious icon, right? They literally, like there's a guy named Augustus Comte, who we might talk about a little bit later on in the semester, who literally almost creates a religion of reason, like where like sort of personified reason gets like worshipped in these like elaborate civic rituals. And what is reason all about? Reason is all about the French state. Right? So in effect, the French state, it becomes the thing that you worship. Armstrong puts it really, I thought it was quite amusing the way she puts it. What you stop being willing to die for your religion and start being willing to die for your state. Right? Which, if what you die for is your religion, means your religion is the state. Right? That the state itself becomes this sort of like monolithic nationalistic force that now is the center of all of those rituals that previously existed. Right? And this is very clear in the French Revolution. It's really elaborate there, because in the French Revolution, literally, like they try to like invent a whole bunch of like festivals of reason that look very similar to Catholic ceremonies, but they're not Catholic now. Now it's festivals to reason and like services in praise of the state and yada yada yada. Right? So as we just sort of invert the object of worship. Nietzsche's going to talk about this a lot later on when we get to him in the semester as well. Okay, how are we doing? People good at this point? Pause, questions, thoughts, comments at this point? Brittany, go ahead. Oh, is that just a thumb? That's just a thumbs up. You're okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was trying.
That's all right.
I was like, that's my head nod.
That's fine. Yeah, I just interpret anything that I see as someone trying to get my attention in some way. So, all right, let's now move to where let's get fun with this now. All right, what ends up happening? We'll finish our history story, and then we're actually going to get to some fascinating little details that Armstrong points out. So what ends up happening is the history of the 19th and 20th century, which we all know well. The new heretics become minority groups within the population. These minority groups that are almost universally, maybe outside the United States at least, and even a lot of the time within the United States, these minority groups are religious groups arguing for their ability to like have some kind of protection for their public performance of their religion. So think like, say, Orthodox Jews, for example, right? Orthodox Jews don't dress like everyone else. There must be something wrong with them, right? They're putting their religion in public by dressing in such and such a way. And is this, I think, certainly we all know where this goes. Nazi Germany might be a fine example of where all this goes. And again, Hitler loved nothing else than putting on a good, very much religious seeming show, where again the state becomes God in some sense or another. And what happens, Armstrong argues, when this takes place is this gives rise to kind of fundamentalist movements. Movements that are like, we need to restore and preserve the traditional religion against these kind of secularizing forces. And almost always then those fundamentalist forces become violent in turn. So her overarching thesis is what gives rise to ISIS? Trying to impose secular democracy on places that don't want it. Right? That the necessary reaction against that is going to be a kind of like insane fundamentalist reaction that actually distorted what the prior religious tradition actually was, which is what ISIS is in her view. All right, so that's big picture. Go through the article. We're going to go through some more individual details because there's some kind of fun little individual details in all of this, and then tie this into the Taylor thesis a little bit. But I just wanted any questions on just any of the history that Armstrong laid out, because he laid out a lot of history. We went through about 500 years pretty fast. So any questions on any of that? All right, good. So now let's turn to actually what's kind of what I find most interesting in all of this. Let's start talking about this word religion. I want to show you all today just how much you all buy into this assumption, even if you think you aren't. All right. Is Islam a religion? We said last time it was, right? Everyone kind of was like, yeah, Islam's pretty obviously a religion. Okay. There is no word in Arabic that translates this word. Indeed, actually, with an Arabic, the Christian Arabs who speak Arabic don't use any word to that corresponds to religion in English. There's also no word in Sanskrit. And so since the founding texts of Hinduism and Buddhism were written in Sanskrit, so now we've called those into question. Someone's bringing up, I was going to go here in just 1 second about the word deen in Arabic. Hold the thought. You're exactly there. There's a word that people in the West translate as religion, but deen does not neatly translate into religion. So hold the thought. It's a good one, but hold it for just a second. And another place where we don't see this, there's no word in ancient Greek or ancient Latin. Indeed, and one of the things that's bizarre about this includes the ancient Latin word religio. if Armstrong is right, even the Latin word religio, which is where our word religion comes from, even that word doesn't mean what religion means in ancient Latin. If Armstrong's right about this, and I think I've seen lots of other people besides her making this claim. She's not the only person who I've seen making this claim. All right, now there are words that translate to something similar, right? In Arabic, and this is the one I'm actually most familiar with, is the word din, that people often sort of translate as religion in sort of when it's sort of Westerners. So, okay, why do I say this word doesn't really translate into religion properly? What's the difference? So din, if you were to translate it most literally, what it would mean is something like custom or law. That's the most literal translation of it. And you might say, well, does it refer specifically to like religious customs and religious laws? And that's the problem. It just means law and custom. Like, it's not distinguishing religious custom or religious law from other kinds of custom or other kinds of law. It's not drawing that as a distinction in the first place. The same thing is true about some of the Sanskrit words as well. And the same thing is true about there's some words in Greek and Latin that you could maybe try to do, not religio actually, weirdly, but there are some words you could try to translate in this way. And again, it's going to be a similar kind of problem. The word religion in English presupposes a distinction between religious and non-religious parts of life. And I'll fix give me 1 second and I'll fix the whiteboard to get this out. And that's a little bit what we were just talking about, actually, right? Like, if everything we're doing is Catholic, like it would be in the Middle Ages, it would be weird to have some specific word to distinguish the Catholic parts of your life from the other parts of your life. Because the claim is that, like, there kind of aren't other parts of your life, right? Like, how the society is organized is it's organized like Catholic-y. How was ancient Greece organized? It was organized ancient Greece-y. How are Islamic societies organized? By the din, right? By the customs and laws governing the society. And if it's an Islamic society, then they're Islamic, right? So we can distinguish what we might be tempted to call different kinds of religions, but almost a better translation in a lot of these languages would be different ways of life rather than different religions, right? So so like Al-Ghazali can say, like, yeah, like, I encountered all those atheists and I didn't understand their deen, right? I didn't understand their way of life, the customs, the habits that they were living. Right? Now they're atheists, right? And we would be prone to say that an atheist would be someone who denies this religious part of life, right? That the atheist maybe only has the non-religious parts of life, but that's their deen then, right? That's their way of living, right? Those are the laws and customs that they follow. The word religio, actually, there was a chat question I want to get back to. Someone was asking, and I think it's a really good one. Is it so the tendency of people in the West? Someone's asking to translate deen as religion. Is that reflecting a kind of almost just Western prejudice and imposing that upon the Islamic world? Then, at least in a lot of cases, I think the answer is yes. I mean, translation is hard. I never want to give translators too much trouble. I've tried to do translation myself, and it's super difficult. But I think at least part of what is going on in that context is assuming a certain kind of structure of life as just being natural, necessary, always present, right? That there are religious and non-religious parts of life that we can, and that's almost presupposed by this English word. What is the word? Actually, let me just pause again. I'll go back to the whiteboard, so don't worry. But I just want to pause for a second. Questions, thoughts, comments at this point? Please, Kevin, go ahead.
So when I was learning Arabic, my teachers, all of whom were except for one who was a Coptic Christian, all of whom were Muslims from either Sudan or Iraq, Morocco, places like that. They told me that deen does mean religion, while specifically because the way it's been adopted now, it specifically is talking, Din al-Masihiyun, Din al-Islami, Din al-Yahudin. It does translate to religion, but the point that you're making does probably influenced a lot. But if you were to go over there now and you were to use the word deen in any kind of conversation, they would assume you were talking specifically about religion. Now, a lot of languages don't have specific words for that stuff. I think the Inuits, when we went up to Alaska, they had 63 words for snow, but no word for God. So it's more or less, it's become, as the ideas came in, it was more or less adopted, and it means basically the same thing at this point.
Yes, and we'll talk about that. Actually, that's just where I want to go in a second. In fact, because I think there's something very much true to that. Though if you read the older stuff, at least, that it certainly gets iffier. You read the older Arabic sources, but yes, but the thing to note there again, that would be a particular. So where I'm going with all of this, it's a particular, if we want to say deen means religion, that's fine, because it's just translation, right? Translation's always imperfect. But we would at the very least have to be careful of not assuming one particular system of religious formulation or of world construction or of societal organization and assume that that's the only one. And that's the one that's being presupposed by every use of the word. So I am indeed, yes, I think you're quite right that at least many modern Muslims would use it in a way that would be more or less compatible. But just that itself, we just assume that we mean the same thing by religion. Again, that itself would be a question. What is this word? Again, that's the central question of the class even. What does this word religion even mean in English when we say it? Right. So, but I do take your point. And again, there's a lot of individual nuance that I am alighting over just in an effort to try to talk about as many different traditions as possible. But so your point is indeed well taken. But I just want to say, like, what we even mean by this English word religion that we're translating it into, again, was just something that I want us to be just cautious of and open to uncertainty about. Good. Any others? All right. Someone in the chat is actually asking something. So someone's asking, it seems like it's that many of these words that we tend to translate as religion, they seem more like umbrella terms. You could say that, but that itself maybe is making a particular assumption about what religions are, right? I mean, we're going to read Al-Ghazali actually, and Al-Ghazali's position basically just is any way of life is a religion. Right, that is the proper phenomenon that is being pointed out here, is the ways of life. That's what actually matters. And so the atheists are religious because they have a way of life. It just, he thinks, is a stupid one. But it doesn't mean it's not a way of life. It's just a stupid way of life. Right? And so that's going to be an option we're going to put very seriously on the table when we get to it. That's more going to be the second half of the course, because people in the West don't tend to talk that way. But in the second half of the course, we're going to very seriously bring this option up. It's going to match also how some of the Buddhist sources talk, and it's also going to match with how a lot of the ancient Greek sources talk too. So, good so far? Awesome. Good. All right. Then I want to now actually turn to this English word religion even. Because actually I want to suggest that the word religion in English originally didn't even mean religion. That's, again, just how weird this story is going to get. So this religio word in Latin. Right? This is Latin. Right? This word basically just meant virtuous person. That's basically what it meant. So religio is basically just like a good person, a reliable, trustworthy person. And so some of the early Christian authors, when they're doing Christian apologetics, they're saying that, like, no, like you non-Christian Romans, yes, you do have your religio, you have your virtuous people, right? Like Socrates or Cicero or whatever, right? And we're also religio, we're also virtuous people, right? And so it doesn't refer to, weirdly, right? It doesn't, we have no direct reference to things like gods or anything like that. Though, of course, virtue might well involve piety. Piety might be an example of a virtue. That's possible. That would be debated in ancient Rome, but there would be people in ancient Rome who would indeed think that part of being a religio would be being pious, having that virtue of piety. Okay, when it gets translated into English, so when we get the religious word religion, as far as I can tell, the word religion enters the English language around the 10th century. That's a bad, I'm sure it could be a little earlier, but a lot of the earliest uses I could find, at least, they're right around the 10th century. So it's a pretty old word then. We're at the old, that's Old English at that point. That's not English that any of us could necessarily read or understand. What it means when this word gets introduced is basically a monk. To question beg people who take religious vows. Right? And so the religious are the monks, right? People who maybe took a vow of poverty, so they refused to own any worldly possessions. They took a vow of chastity. They refused to engage in the normal family structure of life. Maybe they took vows of silence, right? They denied themselves speech. They took vows of mendicancy, that they would sort of wander around preaching. And all this was a big deal. There were all these sort of monastic vocations that no longer exist at all in Christianity. Maybe in some parts of Catholicism, you still see them a little bit, but like even in mainline Catholicism, all of this kind of monastic stuff is completely gone. That's what the word is originally referring to. So the religious are the monks. And this is in contrast to the non-religious, who were all the other Christians. So, surprise, in Old English, unless any of you are a monk, you are non-religious. Now, doesn't mean not Christian, doesn't mean not Catholic in particular, but Christian meant Catholic during this time. Right? But you're not religious in the sense that you haven't taken the vows, you're not committed to it in a certain kind of way, right? So what would, I mentioned this earlier, right? The sort of shocking fact that like the average person went to church maybe once a year, right? Like, they're Christians. They did indeed go to church once a year. They thought Christ was their savior, right? They would venerate saints, right? They would maybe even venerate artifacts, icons, right? All that fine, right? But they didn't take the extra step of leaving the world, quite literally the secular world, the secularum, behind, right? To embrace a higher vocation, the higher Christian vocation. Right? And so it's almost as if there's two speeds of being Christian is what's being suggested here. There's the religious speed, the higher speed, this is Taylor's language, right? Where you're like, you go all out with it. You give up normal worldly pursuits to fully embrace Christianity, or you live kind of a normal life as a Christian and sort of hope your salvation is almost getting worked out by the people at the higher speed, right? Or by taking part in the public civic life of the church. Right, so I don't know what any of those crazy people are saying when they're delivering these Latin sermons, but I'm trusting that it's helping me out religiously. Right? It's putting me on the right track religiously, even if I don't understand what's going on or what any of it means. There was a real fear amongst the peasantry in the late Middle Ages of going to confession, because they thought if they that like there were things they didn't kind of want to confess, so they thought if they just never went to confession, they wouldn't be lying to God about it. that is not a religious attitude, right? Like, so, right? Like, even though they're Christians, and right, but it's not religious in the sense of it's not like embracing the higher parts of the practice. Right? How are we doing? Is this making it's super weird? But is this working on the linguistic situation? Magnus, go ahead.
So I was just thinking, I know still in at least the Catholic Church, and it might be the case with various Eastern Orthodox ones, the priests, and I think technically even like bishops, still use the religious and secular distinctions.
Yep, absolutely.
Which is interesting that they still hold on to secular, even with all of the modern connotations.
Yeah, even because indeed the ancient connotation of the word secular, we'll talk about this. The word literally just means normal time. That's actually what the word secular actually means. You're living a normal life rather than the religious life, right? The life of someone who sort of gives up normal worldly pursuits for the sake of something else, something transcendent, something higher of the normal worldly pursuit. Yeah, and there are still elements of this within Catholicism, way more so even within Eastern Orthodox. Because the Eastern Orthodox tradition really never fell out with monasticism. Catholicism a little bit falls out with it, not fully, not as much as the Protestant churches do, but the Eastern Orthodox fully embraces monasticism in a way that even Catholicism still doesn't. Good. Any others? All right. So if all of this is right, again, we're just laying out the history, laying out the linguistic situation. So if all of this is right, and again, everything I just said about the word religion, right, that is specific to Western Europe, right? That stuff's not going on anywhere else necessarily. It's not even going on in the Eastern Orthodox part of Christianity, like we said, and it certainly wouldn't be applicable to an Islamic context or a Jewish context or anything like that. But okay, notice how far that is from there are religious and non-religious parts of life, right? That me just as a normal dude wandering around the world, sometimes I'm going to go to church and I'm going to do church parts of life, and that's when I'll be being religious. And other times I'm going to go to my job, and that's when I'm going to be doing my economic activities. And other times maybe I'm going to like take part in politics and vote, and that'll be when I'm doing my citizen stuff. And other times I'll be like chilling with my friends in a bar, and that'll be my friend part of life, right? And maybe my family part of life, and my watching YouTube videos parts of life, right? I mean, like that religion is just one thing you do at some times. The claim that's being made in this, claim's not the right way of putting this. What's implied by the older use of the word religion in English, at least, is that no, the religious person is the person for whom that religious part of life is all of their life. Right? It's the thing that, like, it's the bow that surrounds everything you do. So if the religious person was to take part in economic activity, which normally they wouldn't, right? They would take part in economic activity as a Christian. Or in Al-Ghazali, when he writes the Science of Human Happiness, right? The Science of Human Happiness is doing every single part of your life as a Muslim. That's the science of human happiness, right? It's having that not just be something you do, it's the way you do everything that you do. Now, in the Christian context, not everyone is thought to be able to do that, right? That's why you've got the people living their secular lives, but at least the monks are the ones who everything that they do in dedication of God. And, hopefully other people are doing that as best they can to the extent that they can. Someone's asking in the chat, it almost sounds more like the word devotee or something. Where, yeah, we might now talk about people who are like really devoted to their faith. Right? That more has the sense of what religion just in general kind of meant in the 10th century. Right? Because again, it goes back to that Latin root. The Latin root is just like the excellent man, the excellent person. That's a religio, right? It's just the excellent man, right? So not just any old practitioner, the best practitioner, the practitioner who's practicing the best. That's the religious one. Right? I mean, you almost can make this make sense in modern English, right? When I say like, yeah, I'm religious about exercising. right? What does that seem to mean? It means something like, I'm really taking it seriously. Like, I don't just like idly do it. I'm doing it all out. I'm fully committed to it. I eat to exercise. I sleep to exercise. Everything I do is sort of oriented around it in some sense. And so again, now let's go back to the Armstrong. That's the thing that Armstrong thinks is getting overlooked in terms of the history of liberal democracy in the Arabic world. Right? When you get through various kinds of colonial enterprises, British, French, German, people come in and say, no, guys, don't be religious in that sense. Be religious in the sense of like, yeah, just go to church occasionally, fine, but otherwise just be great economic citizens, right? Or otherwise just be loyal subjects of the British crown, right? That almost just doesn't make any sense. That's kind of incoherent from a certain perspective, at least, right? Unless you're already buying into, right, the Protestant sense that religion just is this private thing. Sorry. Right? Because if this is right, what is your way of life? Your way of life is a way of life where you go to church sometimes, and then other times you do economic things, and then other times you do family things, and other times you do TV watching things, right? And all of these things are just different fragmented parts of life. That is a way of life. That is articulating a particular vision of how human beings should live. It's weird to think of that as a religion, but at least based on the classical use of the term, it's more of a religion than the I just go to church on Sundays thing is. All right, how are we doing? Is this okay? Have we laid out some foundation here a little bit? People got questions, people got thoughts, comments. I mean, notice the weird thing, the word that I haven't said at all this entire class period is God. I've somehow managed to go very nearly this entire class session and the word God hasn't come up once. I don't think. I think this is the first time I've said it. Right? Now, we're going to need to add that into the story. Something's obviously missing from my story if we haven't talked about God yet. And that's what we're going to turn to in Taylor next week. So Taylor is going to begin. His goal is not really to give us a definition of religion. His goal is actually more going to be to give us a definition of secularism, actually. Along the way, he's going to need to give a definition of what he means by religion to get to his definition of secularism. The way he's going to go about doing it is, I think, more Western, and he acknowledges it works well in the West. It might not work as well when we leave the Western context behind. He's going to define religion basically as a view that sees human happiness as ultimately being dependent upon some transcendent source of meaning. Right? So that a religious person, Taylor's going to say, is someone who believes that human happiness can only be attained by taking part in something higher than the human, something more than the human. He's going to use that then to define secularism. In contrast, is the view that human happiness can be attained within the scope of normal human activity. And we're going to try to explore his justification of that definition, because he's presenting it as something he thinks people are going to find controversial. He doesn't think people are going to necessarily be all on board with this. So what he's going to do in the rest of the book is basically try to justify that account of secularism and seeing how we got to the point now where religion just seems like, I believe in God, therefore I'm religious. How do we get to that point from where we started at the late Middle Ages? All right. If no one has anything else for me, I'm trying to keep these down to around an hour because I know the Zoom is hard. So unless anyone has anything else they'd like to add or bring up, I think this would be a great place probably for us to stop for the day. Please, Kevin, go ahead. You're still muted.
I was just waving goodbye.
Oh, you're just waving goodbye. Sorry, I thought you were. thought you were doing. Thought you had hand raised. Sorry. All right, good. So yeah, if no one has anything else, let's call it here for the time being. We'll gonna pick up right from these same issues, right? All we did today was just lay out some weird questions, almost. I hope, right? And notice some sort of oddities of the linguistic and historical situation. So what we're gonna turn to now, Taylor is a philosopher. He's not a religious historian like Armstrong was. So he's gonna actually start giving us some sort of rigorous accounts of things. So what I'd like you to do for next time, read the introduction. It's about 15-ish pages, something like that. So it's not too long, not too bad. He's going to give you three definitions of what he means by secularism. Try to identify all three of them, and then see why the last one is the radical one. The last one is the one that I just said, basically. So try to track out this movement, and then we'll just start working our way through with him on Tuesday. All right, no daily assignment. We'll do one together collectively. Otherwise, hope you all have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks.
You too.
I had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So just so I know sort of where